This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
This week we have Gwendolyn, Floyd, and Joshua Kauffman from Regional, and they're going to be talking about their experiences designing for Cuba. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Neil, and thank you all for coming. Also, thank you to Professor Winograd, who's not here today. As Neil said, we are Regional. We're co-founders of this larger network of researchers and designers. We work in architecture, product, and service design. We also do innovation consulting. As a side note, Gwen's stuff is currently in MoMA and also in the Smithsonian and Cooper Hewitt National Design Triennale. And we've been doing projects recently in the United States, Cuba, China, Europe, and elsewhere. So our work takes us right across the world. And today we're going to share with you an aspect of our work that we've recently done in Cuba. We've framed the argument and written in such a way to try to cater it to the HCI work that you guys are doing, and we hope that you enjoy it. So thanks for having us.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Is it loud enough? Kind of, more or less? All right. Some of the most critical questions about technology expose its nature as a political force and as a central component of development and democracy. Development as a concept is thought of as a transformation of society. In many societies, this transformation is coming from the changing relationship between humans and digital technology. And the transformation that we thought would previously come from massive transfers of knowledge and ICT is now appearing largely through personal technologies such as the mobile phone and home computer.
So today, as I said, we're here to talk about what we can learn from the emerging technology in Cuba. And we chose to study Cuba and live in Cuba for, on a couple occasions because it has a rich history, a vibrant present, and the subject of change is increasingly in there, inside and outside of the country. But as far as the world of technology and HCI goes, it's basically as close to a case study of a walled garden as you can get. So the permeability of its borders for people, ideas, and materials is really low, and within the country, information flows within a tightly choreographed system. As designers, all of us, especially those of us that work with the web and digital technology, we often turn to the web as a solution to design challenges. However, in Cuba, the web is nothing like how we know it and how we work with it. So we need to think beyond the idea that the web is a universal tool for change. We can't assume the existence of or impose upon others the expectation of universality of our connected technologies. Though the perception of instantaneity and interconnectivity is justifiably increasing, we must include the individuals and zones that are not connected to us as parts of our global image. Lack of connectivity does not mean that people are not connected. That we cannot see people does not mean that they are invisible. So today we will think with the Cubans, who are master hackers who communicate in highly evolved ways. Half a century of isolation and scarcity also means that they're notoriously good at making more with less. In Cuba and elsewhere, we as designers and also we as Regional, the network that we're part of, take technology to mean the tools that enhance social, political, and economic life. What's important to remember about emerging technology is that its emergent properties not only speak about the technology itself, but about the emerging social impacts that they engender. So in studying Cuba, we sought to learn how Cuban technologies are emerging to develop new types of collective intelligence and social phenomena. In the discourse of designing technology for the developing world that meets social needs, the principal assumption is that government permits technological interference from the outside. In Cuba, the state is meant to have a monopoly on technology, and its official stance is that it meets all social needs. Designing in Cuba asks of the intervener the lightness of not making an impact perceptible by the government's schemas for identifying threatening behavior. The social need of a Cuban person is a design that emancipates them from the technology which currently entraps them.
So there's probably something that you do know that occurred in Cuba in the last few months. Fidel Castro, after nearly 50 years of reign, resigned from his official appointment as president of Cuba. And the next appointed government seems to be following in his revolutionary footsteps. There's probably something that you don't know or aren't as familiar with, and it's the fact that for the first time since the revolution, Raul Castro has welcomed public feedback about the deficiencies of Cuba's socialist system. In response, a student at the Information Science School and leader of the prize government Electronic and Political Surveillance Group publicly challenged the president of the National Assembly, Ricardo Alarcón, regarding the everyday injustices faced by Cuban citizens, including the illegality of normal Cubans to travel abroad, the fact that most foodstuffs are sold in the currency that Cubans do not earn, and especially a lack of access to the internet.
Vamos a luchar porque esto suceda, pero creo que las cosas deben tener un límite y no digamos, una oscuridad en todos los sectores, en todos los sentidos. Realmente no conocemos los elementos hacia dónde vamos.
So here you see he's basically, for the first time in a long time, publicly challenging kind of an official government posting about daily life in Cuba.
So there was something very effective about the previous system of the public discourse, is that you were encouraged to have public discourse, but that public discourse was never recorded and distributed. So it always kind of had an endpoint in the locality of the discourse. This video shows something else.
This Alarcón video leaked and then spread rapidly via flash drive copying. It became a widely viewed document exposing one of their top domestic politicians as incompetent and out of touch. Whereas the Castro designation failed to cause domestic distress, the massive domestic upheaval around the Alarcón video led to the arrest of the student and a staged counter video in which he rescinded his comments. And here you can see. Does it play?
Unos minutos antes de entrar aquí a la sala, que estamos en la Universidad de Ciencias Informáticas.
It's quite sad. You can see his legs shaking. He's obviously been, well, has gotten a good talking to. What the boy was discussing was not a new story. What mattered was that it was documented on video and became social media and public property. To show you just how unique this video was, we should tell you a story about a Cuban friend of ours who saw the Berlin Wall fall 11 years after it actually happened, and who saw reports of the Tiananmen massacre 10 years after the fact, and it only took her 1 week to actually visually experience this Alarcón video. This media event was the first time that most Cubans had felt a sense of participatory political engagement in recent history.
And the recent history that Gwendolyn's speaking of essentially begins when the Soviet Union collapsed. 1991, taking with it $8 billion in subsidies. And that's a lot of money for a small country with 12 million people. It caused the Cuban economy to drop by about 40% and the caloric intake of the individuals to drop by about 35%. Within this crisis, the Cuban government realized that they needed to attract foreign currency and fast, leading them to legalize the American dollar and to encourage a type of entrepreneurship within the socialist system in a general policy of openness and development. It immediately created a stratified double economy of those earning salaries from the state in devalued national currency and those earning in strong foreign currency, such as the American dollar. Seeing a moment of weakness in the Cuban society, the United States realized the importance of bringing information to Cuba and passed the Torricelli Law, hoping that, as Bill Clinton said, liberty will spread by cell phone and computer modem. Cuba interpreted this Torricelli Law to be an act of terrorism and said that the internet represents an invasion sui generis, which is not led by Marines, but by the information which is moved via satellite, fiber optic cables, and Hertzian waves. In 1994, and in this image you can see, things deteriorated so badly in Cuba, people starved, up to 50,000 died from dietary deficiencies that were not shared with the outside world. In response to public riots, Fidel Castro diffused pressure domestically by allowing a mass migration of 20,000 rafters in 2 weeks. And because of the continued unrest that threatened stability, the government changed its tune from economic openness and development to the perfection of socialism. Today, Cuba is not looking predominantly for GDP growth, but for growth that allows the continued sovereignty of the government. While things remain politically static inside of the country, the government is establishing multi-billion-dollar deals with China, Venezuela, and even the United States.
Now, in terms of what the Cuban Revolution has done to people and actual Cuban citizens, the social characteristics of Cuban people come largely from their years of living under the propaganda and security apparatus of the state. They are master propagandists, principally maintaining their power through the control of information. Fidel Castro talked the people through the hardest times by creating diversions and illusions, and consistently fell back on the embargo as a fictional excuse for the government's shortcomings. And here you see, this is 1 day of blockade is equal to 139 public buses. Public transportation is one of the major problems in Havana and throughout the country. And there's quite a few different billboards basically throughout Havana and the country, excusing sort of the most dire problems of the country to kind of an equivalent quantity of kind of the injustices that the embargo supposedly has enforced. And the embargo has been a problem, but it's almost a convenient situation. People say that the embargo has allowed Cuba to live with an internal embargo as well. So it's a perpetual excuse for not actually kind of developing their internal domestic policy. Yet people realize that they are only being partially informed, which manifests itself in an absence of a collective sense of reality. Cuban social life is caught up in the contextualizing of what the government is saying through chisme or gossip, with the intention of determining or sussing out what the truth really is. The state has also mastered security by using an intricate national surveillance network that permeates every aspect of society, such as the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, which is a big brother organization which has an office on the block level of every neighborhood and enforces the values of socialism through a psychological feedback loop of self-censorship. Yet above all else, the government has constitutionalized its right to interpret any civilian act as being a threat to the socialist state. Seemingly harmless things such as congregating in public, inviting someone to your house, or having a library can result in punishment. So not being able to predict the arbitrary application of these laws, Cubans feared the implications of their social behaviors. And this fear has corroded social trust, making collective action almost impossible.
And in this image here, you see a journalist, a very prominent one in Cuba, who was actually imprisoned for 20 years. And what he's holding up is the part of the Cuban law that allows the government to deem any activities as a threat to the socialist state. One thing that the security apparatus does tolerate is the gray economy. And a Cuban economist determined that the state, which is meant to provide for all the needs of the people, only provides 5% of the income required to live a decent quality of life. For the remaining 95% of income, people have to turn to the gray economy. And as a result, it's become incredibly flourishing as a decentralized source of meaning and economic value. It's best called the gray economy because either laws don't exist to prosecute activities within it, or the state chooses not to enforce those laws consistently. It's an economy where just as nothing is allowed, nothing is not allowed either. One way to live within the gray economy, and you'll see them a lot when you're a tourist in Cuba, is to be a jinetero. Jineteros, as you can see here, that's me in the back, can locate resources and experiences for a cost, including one who assumed we wanted to join him in locating a PlayStation in a marginalized area of Havana. Because wealth does come from foreigners, it's manifested in a type of remote control, an example of which is the only Cuban e-commerce here. Carlos Tercera is Havana's famed shopping mall where first world goods are sold at more than first world prices. Foreigners outside of Cuba can buy things from a website that catalogs all the goods inside of this particular shopping mall. Cuban people can then go to that shopping mall and pick up the purchases made remotely on their behalf. And the mall is always full of people, most of whom are looking but not buying. It's an example of e-commerce that's also representative of the massive subsidies that the Cuban economy has that comes through about $1 billion of remittances every year from the Cuban diaspora. Because you can't meet in groups or engage in private enterprise, the gray economy is peer-to-peer and decentralized. It does have a type of market structure insofar as Cubans act as economic agents for their one-degree contacts by trying to match buyers and sellers in their mind at all times based on what they hear throughout the day. Without normalizing the gray economy, the government allows it to flourish because it does successfully fill consumer needs. It is also the testing bed for experimental capitalism to appraise its possibilities in an unofficial forum.
Now, due to this material scarcity, technology emerges mainly from the gray market. There are two main words that Cubans use to describe their behavior within the gray market. When a Cuban uses the word resolver, they are excusing illegal behavior in order to make ends meet. A wonderful illustration of using resolviendo is how an art student bought computer parts out the back of a government-run computer education facility and then assembled the parts into a working computer at home and then continued to actually sell that functioning computer into the front door of the same facility. This process of circulation is interesting because new goods in the market are either negligible or arrive extremely intermittently. So whereas in our part of the world, goods go from the store to your doorstep, in Cuba, all goods are constantly circulating, like a material currency, and get recycled and reused depending on demand. So the gray market is also found in the concepts of inventar, This word has to do with the amazing Cuban ability to improvise with limited resources. This term suggests that everything on the island is miscellaneous and modular. What people consider to be new is often just a new configuration made from a limited range of existing parts.
And in this image here, you see an amazing example of what Gwen's talking about. This house, we were in a town of Santa Clara, and we were walking by, and we said, that wasn't there before, was it? And our friend said, yes, that's a new house. And that is what a new house in Cuba is. And similarly, that's what a new computer would look like metaphorically as well. It's modular, it's miscellaneous, it comes from what's existing. It's a patchwork, it's bootstrapped together, but that's the concept of new there. It's how you do well with what is actually existing and possible.
Individuals also use the barter system to acquire technology. We have a friend, Ioani, here, and her laptop actually came from a man who needed wood. He was in search of wood to build a boat, to build a bocero to get to Florida. So in a sense, they exchanged wood for computers. So it's also this kind of metaphorical relationship between exchanging information freedom for political freedom. Pirating is also a national technological strategy which Castro himself defends as a legitimate response to the damage inflicted by the US economic sanctions. So whereas in other parts of the developing world, IP violations would be a purely economic strategy, in Cuba they are largely political as well.
So for those of us that do work in the developing world, I know, Neil, that you do some work there, who are looking especially into microfinance and other types of market intelligence through the mobile telephony, you must be wondering about mobile telephony in Cuba. And as far as the government is concerned, as of about 3 weeks or a month ago, what you see in the picture, is the type of mobile telephone that is available for the average Cuban person, because Cubans were not technically allowed to have mobile phones. Now, things have recently changed. We're going to talk about those changes in a little bit. The service contracts are now legal to purchase, but they're at an incredible cost, about 240% markup on prices that we're familiar with. So before that, about a month ago, when mobile phone purchases have become legalized, this is how you got a mobile phone. You had to get a mobile phone through a foreigner. You had to befriend one to get activation. And it created a whole micro-industry within that gray economy of Cubans borrowing foreign passports. Ours included was attempted to be borrowed. Whereas in other parts of the developing world, mobile phones are an incredibly powerful and transformative tool that can be used for payment, lending, market intelligence. In Cuba, the limitations placed on independent application development means that their use is perpetually restricted to talking and texting exclusively. Satellite TV is also an interesting technology. TV was initially important for the spread of revolutionary ideas all the way into the early 1960s. It is now a point of social gathering, and it's the most ubiquitous piece of technology in Cuba. The only legal form of television in Cuba is Cuban-made and produced. And whereas satellite TV is illegal, it is the principal mass media alternative to government information. Up to 100 houses share one satellite connection at great risk, as you can see here with the satellite dish with a potato sack covering it. And there are systematic crackdowns, as you can see in this image that we spotted, when the state notices tangible influences in the cultural atmosphere concluded to be arising from the influence of satellite television. The first major crackdown came after huge numbers of youths were noticed to be dressing and mimicking behavior that could only have been learned from satellite television. Enormous fines are placed on individuals who use their homes, such as this one, as nodes for the pirated satellite network. And state brigades, these people here, come to find and remove the dishes and cables. They confiscate everything that's attached to the cable, including the satellite line, the VCRs, DVDs, PlayStations, and even the television itself. Satellite TV introduces the concept of reaching out to the world to learn about new things, however mundane they happen to be. And it's helpful that Cubans can learn from the outside world. But because of the one-way communication, it prevents them from participation in global information exchange.
So as for the possibility of information exchange, the Cuban internet shows us some interesting models of what can happen in a closed information ecosystem. Whereas in most countries, information and communication technology is used for the development of society, Cuba has chosen to instead informationalize and digitize the ideological system of social centralization. Because the government fears counter-revolutionary information, their solution has been to effectively block the internet. Instead, they have provided the intranet, which is much like a closed and highly regulated internet consisting of a few thousand curated web pages that are deemed appropriate by the government, and almost all of them exist on local Cuban servers. In its simplest form, the intranet is seen by most as a replacement for the traditional post system. Addresses are given to every citizen who can then check their email in post offices as well. There's also an interesting emergent evolution of the national intranet email system. It has become the back channel for people to debate, share, and complain. So knowing that officials monitor the email traffic, some people use the back channel as a public forum to indirectly express their dissatisfactions. And sometimes the officials listen to particularly rowdy exchanges and change policy in response to them without having to lose face. One example is the so-called email war that occurred in 2007, where intellectuals engaged in spontaneous debate that resulted in minor change in terms of kind of creative cultural policy.
The internet is principally censored by the restriction of access, as no internet is allowed at home. However, it is accessible in just a few ways. Some internationally oriented workplaces have sanctioned internet, but employees are forced to sign a self-commitment contract to not look for any anti-Cuban material. As for everyone else, there are two main ways to get to the internet. The first one you can see here in this image of one of our partners in Cuba. For $20 to $50, you can purchase increments of nighttime downtime of user accounts from people in industries such as telephone, medicine, and publishing who do have sanctioned internet. Or you can go to the former Capitol building, where hourly internet rates are nearly half a monthly salary, and Cubans don't dare to look at anything but email and gossip, as they feel they could be watched and punished for perusing something considered to be illicit. So as there is a high latent desire to access the outside world, and specifically through the internet, and that in Cuba it's completely acceptable to have strangers come into your house, we did an experiment, which is documented in this image here, where we offered free internet from the house of an artist in Havana. That's the artist, that's his home just behind there, and that's the sign. And immediately after we posted the sign, this is the picture from the other angle, you can see 4 people in the picture there. Observers dispersed quickly to spread the news. You could actually see the message of free internet traveling within this particular barrio. But we quickly learned how fearful people were for doing anything not officially provided by the government. Individuals, including these ones, kindly warned us that we would get in trouble and told us to stop joking. So eventually we did take the sign down.
Because no one was willing to use it. During our research in Cuba, we found ourselves using the term totalitarian hacking for the hacking that occurs in a place that is so centrally controlled. Hacking is the way the state makes things work given such incredible material constraints. Because the Cuban people don't have much to work with, they've inadvertently discovered effective ways of developing a greener society. Cuba has garnered great attention for their ability to achieve energy efficiency. After they lost their Soviet oil subsidies, they turned to solutions such as organic local agriculture, forced adoption of high-efficiency refrigerators and fluorescent light bulbs to conserve energy and resources.
And what you see in this picture here is an image that one of our partners provided with us of on his street when they went from house to house and they forcibly removed all the old refrigerators that were from the late 50s that were potentially containing just 1 or 2 items highly energy inefficient, and they swapped in Chinese high-efficiency refrigerators instead.
So it is also metaphorically in terms of geopolitics, kind of taking America out of the home and putting China into it. So, in Havana, they have converted almost all unused urban land into sustainable urban agricultural plots. But it is important to keep in mind that all of Cuba's advancements in green tech come out of necessity, not out of a moral initiative. In a way, they have hacked elements of their own self-imposed internal political and economic paralysis into an opportunity for encouraging and experimenting with green ideas. Cuba is globally unique in their ability to provide wellness without great environmental impact, and we can learn from them that green living may come not from individual lifestyle choices, but from national policy. In terms of computers, the only hackers that exist work for the government. They've been at it for a long time. Here's a picture of the Titan Scrambler. It's meant to interfere with anti-revolutionary television and radio broadcasts that are sent from Miami. Government hackers exist to defend state supremacy on the Cuban intranet and surveil and disrupt anti-revolutionary content and online debate on publications on the internet. They monitor emails, they slow down the already limited bandwidth with a persistent flow of irrelevant PowerPoints and heavy graphics. And by doing this, they render it all but unusable without having to shut it down completely. And they also make it impossible to exploit the occasional holes found that occasionally individuals can use to sneak through the internet. But perhaps they're at their worst or best when trying to interfere with local bloggers.
The state has not yet crystallized an official stance against blogging, probably because they suspect that doing so would cause an international uproar. Instead, they create conditions that make it practically impossible for Cubans to use the internet legally. And there are a few blogs which are written by citizen bloggers as they constantly face concerted attacks against them. A friend of ours, pictured here, is one of the extremely few Cuban bloggers who works independently, accesses the internet through a combination of legal government facilities, embassies who have satellite connections, that are presumably untraceable by the Cuban security apparatus. But we also know of instances where the security of even embassy systems has been breached, both in terms of network hacking, infiltration by personnel, and communications jamming with magnetic interference. Once her blog was recognized as politically challenging and influential, the Brigade of Quick Response, which persecutes alternative media, began to intimidate and harass her. These brigades are said to be spontaneous, voluntary citizen uprisings, but if citizens cannot access the internet, it's clear where they come from. And Ioanni estimates that about 4 people work full-time to jam and spam her blog every day. These individuals actually went so far as to start a pro-revolution blog on the public platform offered by Spain's national paper, El País, to counter hers. That blog linked to a piece in her authentic blog ridiculing it. Hundreds of comments from Cuban sources contained vile statements and threats. And her blog, Generation Y, has actually become something of a coordination point for debate about Cuba outside and inside of Cuba. She's getting millions of hits a month, and on an average post, thousands of comments. And as a result of the significant work that she's done, she's actually been awarded the most prestigious prize in Spanish journalism.
So where do these threats come from? They come from the UCI, which is the Information Science University, whose official mission is to bring Cuba into the information age and to disperse computer technology cheaply throughout the developing world. The UCI is the largest university in Cuba, and it's housed in what used to be the main Russian base for spying on the United States. When the Russians withdrew their operation, Fidel Castro had a sudden vision of establishing a new army base for the training of 10,000 agents of informationalization. In 1 year, the campus was populated with students selected geographically to represent all areas of the country. Now, upon graduating, those students are forced to return to their local origins as operators and agents of the National Computer Network. The UCI has the newest buildings in Havana and architecturally speaks of how the government believes that IT is going to be their future. Yet it retains the feeling of that old military base in the sense that students are basically not let out and almost no one is let in. So the UCI creates inventive software for medicine and education, such as programs that are used for Cuban doctors to remotely treat patients in distant developing countries. All the software is built using globally available ingredients from open source projects or from code ripped from pirated versions of existing proprietary software. A lot of old hardware, such as MRI machines and servers, are inexpensively acquired, but the software to run them is not. So the Cubans reverse engineer the software to power used and donated technology and medical equipment. Likewise, they also develop powerful software tools that can operate on old hardware so as to avoid the heavy cost of obsolescence. Their goal is to make a desktop computer tower viable for 20 years, something unimaginable in our own models of innovation and adoption. They are developing software for the second lives of the consumer goods we throw away, so they can operate as crucial pieces of technology in impoverished parts of the world. And it's really both ideologically and economically genius, because the Cubans have figured out that it's not only a huge market, but another surefire way to avoid dependence on first world models of production and consumption.
Despite the fascinating models that Gwendolyn spoke about, that the UCI is actually pioneering, it does another thing, perhaps a little bit more pernicious, in that it prepares Cuban IT spies and is developing surveillance and censorship software, as you can see in this image. We were shown around their leading software development facility and given demos of their projects. We were told that these projects were for the promotion of technology to improve medical care. Of the 3 programs we saw, one was indeed to improve medical care, and the other 2 were indisputably applicable for non-medical surveillance and espionage. One was for scanning large amounts of visual information for target words and images, presumably information about the outside world. And the other one was an advanced tool for remotely surveilling the sounds, gestures, and activities in a meeting space at a remote distance. In addition to being a site for information experimentation, the UCI is also a site of economic experimentation. They hope that it becomes Cuba's main cash generator. Every project that the students work on is for profit, which brings wealth to the university and to the central government. Although mobile phones are illegal, or used to be illegal for Cubans, in the mobile phone lab they work on ringtones, animations, and simple games which can then be marketed by Sony Ericsson globally. And although participation for Cubans in the international economy is illegal, in the visual design lab, students create integrated ad campaigns for foreign markets by copying international aesthetics. So, back to the effect all of this has on Cubans. As credible information about the reality of things is a scarce resource, the Cuban social web attempts to produce credible, alternative information through an informal, decentralized word-of-mouth system. In this social web, information resides in the minds of individuals and in the nexus of relationships.
Reliable information comes from a trusted messenger who is inseparable from that message that they are delivering. Those who want to operate independently of the government have discovered open access models of knowledge sharing and creative production. When information like new computer programs arrives or spreads, it's almost never learned alone. So physical spaces of gathering and transport have also become important loci of information exchange. Demand-responsive informal taxis that roam the streets are anonymous and intimate spaces to share frustration and to gossip with strangers. Because of the candid dialogue and steady churn of passengers hopping on and off throughout a route, you could call the taxis almost the thermometer of Cuban society. Now, because meeting in a group is technically illegal, outdoor and verbal public cultures of exchange between limited numbers of people are really popular. What all this shows is that because the social web dwells on the social validation of the authenticity of information, more time is spent trying to ascertain the truth and developing ideas to act on. So without an alternative source of collective information, mobilization based on collective intelligence is quite impossible.
So we're wondering about that alternative source of collective information and how to mobilize the population. And you guys remember the Alarcon video from about a half an hour ago? Well, flash drives, as we mentioned, allowed the video to spread with a ratio of about 20 viewers to every computer. People with computers, such as this one here, act as public neighborhood information galleries and spaces for debate. This gentleman, also a partner of ours, has taken his outdoor wrought iron furniture into his computer room in order to turn it into a cinema of sorts. But with computers extremely sparse, data visibility, copying from flash drive to flash drive, and the dispersion of any sort of information is confined to those in social networks with computers. Therefore, the vast majority of the Cuban population must depend on word of mouth to hear of something like the Alarcon video. Whereas we know Cuban word of mouth tends to lose its value when its authenticity is questioned, in the case of the perfectly copied, digitally propagated Alarcon video, the message didn't modulate an iota. And here you can actually see somebody on the street in Havana showing off one of their flash drives where the video was coming in from. The widespread viewing of that video brought people a sense of a higher political awareness and engagement. It showed the social value of free information without the use of the internet and the impact that information can have on a closed ecosystem. And we wanted to learn from the successful flash drive-enabled visibility of the Alarcon video to understand how to design for spreading another crucial media moment to a greater proportion of Cuban people should it happen. We learned from how Cubans communicate that live, person-to-person information sharing is a culturally rooted behavior that best contextualizes the message being spread. We also learned from how Cubans congregate that transient and anonymous public spaces offer a sanctuary to link into the interpretive networks of strangers without having to keep in constant contact with them.
So to accelerate and free the transmission of information, we realized that we needed to liberate flash drives from depending on the scarce computers for information copying. Then to spread the viewing experience beyond computer screens, we realized that we needed to bring in the lowly and ubiquitous TV as a main visualization medium. So to help the Cuban people free the information, we proposed to design a simple dual-function device. The first function is a rapid flash drive to flash drive copier that would facilitate digital information sharing in public places. Because information, as we know, is already shared in public places through gossiping. All of these face-to-face interactions could support a mesh network of digital information exchange that physically passes vital alternative content between people at a juncture that is historically used for social contextualization. The second function of the device is an output jack from the flash drive for the content to be able to be viewed on television. It's a simple function that turns every living room into a space for review and debate. It also allows the TV, a medium for official messaging, to be used for peer-to-peer production and creation.
The possibility of social transformation from such a simple device is incredibly high. But we know from current flash drive use that most of what travels between people through the flash drives are soap operas and other pirated movies. But we see it as a really great thing because when sensitive information does happen to appear, it guarantees that it would spread widely with that entertainment content. And once these drives become repositories and conveyors for all sorts of information, you can imagine them as stand-ins for mobile phones, providing the platform for banking, finance, and applications yet to be developed. Now, it's important to remember that we as regional are just designers, and our proposal in Cuba is a hypothetical design solution for an informationally impoverished area. We're not trying to meddle in the internal affairs of the Cuban people. In fact, we don't even believe that instigating an immediate political transition in Cuba would have positive results.
There are historical examples where P2P sneaker nets, like the flash drive system in Cuba, have supplemented official media to produce and offer an alternative social reality. It has even led to tangible social change. The first example that comes to mind is Samizdat, which was a self-publishing and reproduction system where documents were effectively passed in the Soviet underground. They had a significant role in the information sharing that led to the effects of glasnost and eventually the opening of the USSR. In Cuba and the former Soviet Union, we see how innovation dually is spawned from the scarcity in materials and the scarcity in political freedoms. So these examples show how innovation in communication technology flourishes where information is scarce or its intention is in doubt. We can learn from our Cuban invention to think about person-to-person information sharing in other parts of the world as well. So informationally impoverished areas exist because of developmental deficiencies. We could imagine that such computer-free copying, sharing, and viewing would empower people where computer and cell phone technologies are costly and scarce. We could also imagine a new urbanism in our part of the world that connects people through the physical act of sharing. Let us not forget the physical embodiment of information and the humanity that comes from person-to-person contact and exchange. Imagine a new type of mesh networking that relies on the committed touch of another person, rather than the automatic communication between devices.
Bringing it all back to Cuba, the last 50 years of the revolution, by our assessment, has pruned all dreams, self-actualization, and democratic practices. Most Cubans have been born after the revolution and have not experienced meaningful change either individually or nationally. And in places where imagination has been sterilized, in Cuba and in other places, connectivity should offer the experience of an alternative so that it can be the basis of the thinking of a new reality. The first step to reclaiming Cuban civil society would be an information sharing platform that could extend the information economy beyond the boundary of goods exchanged to include knowledge sharing, debate, and civic engagement.
And taking inspiration from the informal economy that's thriving so rapidly there.
And what's happened in the last weeks has given some hopes that decentralization and information sharing will only increase. The government, if you haven't read it at all, has made the purchase of mobile phones, DVD players, and other devices legal. Now, they do charge that hefty markup of 240%, and they offer them only exclusively through government-owned stores. These technologies have been available through the informal market to wealthy individuals, so the offer of them will improve their availability, but not their affordability. Though it seems that the normalization of the availability of communications technologies is a positive gesture, it is largely the government's attempt to centralize, formalize, and profit from the democratic practices already existing within Cuba, that being the decentralized marketplace. For example, a few weeks ago, concurrent with the announcements of these liberalizations, they also blocked access to the few online marketplaces that were being used in Cuba to trade goods and services freely, something like a downscaled Craigslist.
On the intranet, on the Cuban intranet. Yeah.
So here we see how a government approaches potentially threatening technologies strategically, proactively guiding their adoption, development, and usage to promote their own interests and priorities. In the case of the internet, while reactive strategies respond to existing or potential challenges of internet use, proactive strategies do attempt to develop an internet that is free from such challenges while also consolidating or extending the state authority.
Now, to contemplate emerging technology in another special case, we can also look at contemporary Iran, which is home to the 4th largest blogosphere in the world. That blogosphere thrives in spite of and in support of the authoritarian and repressive government. A democracy of thought can occur in the absence of governmental democracy. It suggests that pluralist technologies bring pluralist behaviors, allowing the coexistence of various political and social realities, which can thrive even within the most constraining political environments. People are wondering what will come next for Cuba. Will it be democracy? But democracy is not something to be spread, but to be realized. In Cuba, with the promotion of alternative modes of information exchange, such as the one we're proposing or various other potential models, the prospects are great for building meaningful social capital and promoting civic engagement. In such an environment, people could subtly and gradually experience the freedom and responsibilities of democratic production and living without the sudden and dramatic state change that some are demanding. And that's what we have. So we'd love to kind of hear feedback, or if you have questions.
Open up a discussion.
There's an enormous body of research that we've done. We could only kind of comment on certain elements of it. Yes?
Are you guys still welcome back in Cuba? Because I mean, people I know who live in Cuba, they usually get minders that kind of follow them all over the place. So
yeah, we were followed.
Those people that you know that went to Cuba, did they officially announce their arrival in Cuba?
I believe so. They're part of some State Department. We're going to spread democracy and culture.
And if you do announce yourself, they deliver you on prepackaged tours of things that they want you to see, and things ultimately that they would want to promote the visibility of.
Because there are positive things happening, but it's so hierarchized. There is one fantastic hospital in Cuba, or in Havana, but normal Cubans aren't allowed to visit it. They visit, I mean, the hospitals that they have access to are far less kind of complementary to health. So we were, I mean, the thing is they were aware of our presence. We were followed, but they also, I mean, granted, due from a pressure from a kind of very successful business in Cuba, they allowed us to enter this kind of top secret government facility dealing with information science, and they gave us a tour. Yeah, so it was
So they knew
interesting and
essentially what
complex.
we were doing, but as you can see from the work that we do, we're very interested in the great gains that have been made in Cuba up until this point, and in celebrating them and in promoting them to an extent. We didn't get a chance to talk so much about the urban agriculture or the wellness programs, the life expectancy, the educational programs, but Cuba has made incredibly great strides in those areas with very limited resources. So as a result, they do pose models that a lot of us could be inspired from.
Or a potential third model of development. And if there's a slow transition from the government, kind of the centralized socialist government, to a more decentralized, open and democratic processes, while maintaining a lot of the positive, both technological, kind of urban and agricultural systems they're developing slowly, that would be very interesting, a very interesting model.
That's a very good point also. Many people are now thinking about the credit crisis and what will happen to the global economy as a result of it. And those who are saying that the effect won't be that extensive are using the connectivity between the emerging markets as a central part of their argument, that less of the global economy is dependent upon the United States, that when the United States gets sick, London sneezes. This type of concept doesn't exist any longer because of the connections that are being made between China and Latin America, in Cuba, for example, and the over $1 billion a year of trade that happens with China. And when we talk about the third way, we speak about how it's not this bipolar world of developed and developing any longer, but there's so many gradients of developing within there, and many of those countries that are occupying those gradients act as conduits between the developed world and the traditional developing world. Cuba being one of them. That much of what they're trying to do with technology is trying to make sure that the lifespan of the ideas that we generate, of the technology that we create, of the institutions that we begin, that lifespan gets extended and that it gets better customized for the rest of the world.
And also in terms of, I know we've talked to a lot of kind of urban philosophers and urban planners and architects, and Cuba's an amazing inspiration as well, because I mean, more and more the world is starting to consider itself as a walled garden. And to be able to actually be somewhere which actually has been functioning for 50 years, and its infrastructure and its social policy, everything reflects that, and to see how they've been able to come out of it or survive in a way and also develop very interesting models is an inspiration as well for the kind of, for the world at large in view of its kind of environmental issues and its, the breaking down of borders and the kind of globalism in itself.
Democracy, also a subject that if people are interested in, it's a great case study to look at, that democracy isn't necessarily a property of a governmental system, but it's a property of the pluralistic behaviors that can happen within any type of governmental system. Yet another expansion of the discussion of democracy that I think we should all be having. Any other questions?
I see on your website there's reference to China and other places. What insights do you have on how to help free information flow in Cuba? How does that apply to other places like China or Vietnam or Korea or Venezuela? Or do you see applications in other places as well?
It's a great question. It's a very good question because, yet again, there's such variety amongst a lot of these countries. And we were speaking with some people that were involved with Grameenphone, and they were talking about, well, how does technology and how does information sharing come to certain countries? And much of it could be just based upon personal relationships. To compare China and Cuba, China does have the financial resources to be able to censor and filter through information at a much higher fidelity and granularity, whereas with Cuba, as you see, the way that information is prevented is through access. That's one type of design challenge to overcome. In China, it's much more on target keywords and even individual URLs. To overcome that design challenge is a very different question.
But also in terms of being inspired, the actual human networks and sort of the embodiment of a potential mesh network and the technologies that can accessorize that. I think that both, I mean, North Korea and China and Cuba, and there's places in Africa as well that we've talked to develop, basically development sociologists, these types of technologies still have a massive place because everyone is hailing the internet. I mean, the internet's going to solve the world problems. It's going to inevitably cause mass democracy, but there's still enormous swaths of the world's kind of geography and the population that is not going to have access to internet for a long time, just due to infrastructural issues.
So our response in some cases has been the one laptop per child policy. Intel has its own program. HP is doing its own childhood computer, sort of portable computer. What we're saying is, well, what technology already does exist? What social forms of gathering already exist? How can you design something that could spread information very cheaply?
And that's culturally sensitive and specific. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about the split between what resources that are provided by the government versus resources that are provided by the gray economy? Because it seems like if 95% of resources are already provided by the gray economy, it sounds like Cuba is more capitalist than the US.
And that's the irony of it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, a lot of it has to do with the protection of the notion that the socialism there is working. And a lot of the perpetuation of the system is largely a result of the ability of the informal economy to provide for the needs of the individuals. The goods that flow through Cuba can basically come in two camps. One is the goods that are already there that are just constantly circulating and getting reused, and that causes all sorts of interesting industries, also part of the informal economy, that facilitate the improvisation with those tools or the retooling of those tools. And the other is the tourists, the remittances, the Cuban diaspora, and everything that comes in there. So you do have this idea of export within borders, which is not our concept, but a concept that many social thinkers are using to understand how the Cuban economy can grow without actually having to physically go to the outside world or really embrace or interact with the outside world greatly. Sources of money include tourists and all the things that you can do, such as the PlayStation finding for us that we did, facilitating any types of resource sharing or resource finding. And then the diaspora, the remittances themselves. And there's a very healthy black market that comes from that. The government also is not complicit with the informal market directly, but the people that worked for the government may be complicit. So for example, there's a circulation of, with the satellite TV, just as an example, you saw the image of them pulling down the satellite TV and everything that's connected to it. But we didn't say what happened to that technology afterwards. That technology is then resold and brought back into the fray.
Oftentimes to the same previous owners. So a few weeks later, someone will come with a strikingly familiar television set with a strikingly familiar sticker on it, try to resell it back to them in the front door, because they understand that there's an entrepreneurial spirit already existent in that individual, which is actually difficult to develop within Cuba. So that's the market that they'll be able to sell it to.
It's a big crisis, and it will be the defining factor in what happens in domestic politics, because there are two currencies in Cuba. And imagine if we had two currencies in the United States. One currency for people that were working with the government, and the other currency for those that were able to do whatever they wanted to do, as well as have transfers of income. And about 60% of the country has some type of access to convertible currency. Only 40%, a significant part of the country, completely depends upon the government. That means that the currency that they receive can only be used to buy goods that are provided by the government. So about half the country is existing in a double economy that exists parallel to the economy, which is through this export within borders completely subsidized and remote controlled from the outside of Cuba.
And the convertible currency is worth about 24 times as much as the Cuban peso.
So there's constantly talks about will they abandon one for the other? What will happen to the Cuban peso? There are constantly runs on the bank when rumors spread that they're going to abandon one or the other.
Or revalue it.
Or revalue it.
Yeah.
Usually what happens when there's two currencies, there's a law called Gresham law, and the good currency will disappear from trade and be replaced by the bad currency, but it doesn't sound like that's happening.
Well, it's a different, it's an artificial system that is an ideological currency. And therefore it's already fake in a way. And it's serving ideological, not commercial purposes. And therefore the question is, when will the kind of political system change, and what will the ramifications of that, and what are the ramifications that will have on the currency and the double currency?
So a lot of this seems to be about transfer of materials and information into Cuba, while the other way back out. It seems like they've got a lot of lessons in terms of reuse and hacking, use and repurposing. Any thoughts on that? Or?
I think that's one of the reasons we were inspired to go. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of their environmental policy, the technologies that we presented that are being developed at the Information Science School that are incredible models for the developing world. Different social systems are also fascinating, in healthcare and the elderly as well, since they don't have the money actually to overly medicate their elderly. They develop social systems.
Hepatitis B, there are only 3 vaccines that exist in the world. The United States, France, and Cuba have them, and the most effective hepatitis vaccine actually comes from Cuba. That was just developed with indigenous biotechnology knowledge.
So they're really also aware of the kind of the plant life and the botanical implications that it could have. Again, the social technology I was talking about, instead of applying them with lots of medication, since they don't have the financial resources to do so, they actually get them together physically, and the impact that's had on their social well-being and the longevity of their life and basically productivity has been astounding.
And we found great interest amongst some of the largest health insurance companies as well as hospital networks for what's actually happening in Cuba, the ability to provide incredibly effective healthcare without pharmaceuticals, without technologies as we know them, just working on social relationships and camaraderie instead.
So hopefully people will take more and more attention. It's unfortunately a relatively difficult place to penetrate or to understand kind of holistically. Because if you go as a tourist and you're officially announced, then the Cuban government will kind of guide you around to show you a very select view of what's going on there. Yeah, and as you know, as an American citizen, it's very difficult to gain access to it.
But a lot of us, I mean, whatever the field that we're working in, we'll need to pay a lot more attention to Cuba. There's a recent discovery of huge deposits of oil and natural gas that are halfway between Cuba and Florida. This could be an interesting flashpoint. Also, the developmental strategy that Cuba has taken on largely factors in tourism and the potential future service industry that comes from taking care of people in a sort of longer form type of tourism. Lifestyle tourism, or even the transplantation of people from one place to another for care. They're expecting to build hundreds of thousands of hotel rooms over a period of time, and that means that just like with Glasnost and Gorbachev's idea that foreign people and foreign ideas will start to intermingle and then that will lead to a type of integration, that this permeability of the border will be broken. And up until this point, in terms of the mimetic presence of Cuba has largely been determined either by the formal state apparatus that cultivates, supports, and then promotes Cuban artistry to the outside world. The Buena Vista Social Club is probably the most prominent example of that. And then the tourists that come and take whatever information they want to and then spread that to the rest of the world. But that's primarily a romanticization of the decrepitude and the way that the cities and spaces and people have eroded as a result of it.
And this is by far not the most interesting parts of the country. Yes.
I'm interested to learn more about the hypothetical design solution you came up with, the flash drive copier and the link to TVs.
Yes.
For instance, suppose that wouldn't be hypothetical and would become a reality. How do you envisage distributing it, spreading it within Cuba?
We support from various NGOs and embassies actually in Cuba, so we've discussed it with them, and they actually already give away the simple flash drives like candy. And they have connections to independent libraries, communities of artists, kind of the underground social communities and civic clubs that exist. So in terms of distribution, I think that has been pretty covered, or we're pretty confident that could be widely distributed. It's just now finding the right funder and solving the technological problems. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
For the time being, that's still in the idea stage for your work?
Yes, it's an idea stage, but we're talking to developers and investors, and we have the relationships with the NGOs and embassies.
So, as Gwen says, it's basically a question of who's going to finance it and precisely what form will it take, because it does link into a lot of the efforts and enables a lot of the efforts that are already happening in Cuba at the moment to help accelerate information exchange.
And we're also approaching it not just as a solution for Cuba. I mean, the more we talk to specialists, there's definitely a place for it in various places in Africa. If it could penetrate North Korea, it's also an opportunity because the television is incredibly and surprisingly ubiquitous technology in a lot of different places in the world. Yeah.
Any last questions? Yeah?
Yeah.
I'm especially interested in the entrepreneurship and the level of ingenuity that's sort of very latent, sort of untapped, it seems, amongst the Cuban people. How does the government perceive that sort of latent potential? Do they see it as a threat? And in what ways are they going to be encouraging certain people to take more entrepreneurial positions?
Well, in fact, in that time period when all those bolseros left and there was a lot of crisis, it was actually the golden age of entrepreneurship in Cuba. So there's a little bit of a recent history of entrepreneurship. And what ended up happening is that they repealed a lot of that because there was so much instability in terms of food, in terms of basic security and hygiene factors for the population. So their last experimentation with entrepreneurship in the early to mid 1990s was, for them, a failure, largely because it was a threat. These days, there's a lot more organization within the government. They have a much greater control over the idea of where the country is going. And the entrepreneurship is tacitly encouraged. The Cuban government is on record. They're quoted as, senior officials are quoted as saying that the types of productive uses of land, for example, that are engendered from just individual initiative are far more productive than what the government can do within centralized efforts. So, for example, a tacit encouragement of it is the redistribution of about 50% of the arable land in Cuba to farmers, to individual farmers, who have to provide a certain quota of produce to the government, but who are then able to sell that produce as an incentive for doing what they do so well. So they are tacitly encouraging it, and as a result, there's going to be far better foodstuffs that are available for the Cuban people.
And this happened 2 weeks ago.
Just 2 weeks ago.
But their overall kind of umbrella policy regarding entrepreneurship is they have a relatively negative perception of it. They want to, because of with the farming, because they can maintain a very specific control over it, control over what's produced, how it's distributed, etc., but while still maintaining a pure profit in a way. But on the ground, sort of small-scale entrepreneurship, they see as a threat.
And of course, it depends to what extent. Incredibly small, they don't mind it at all. If you're
it's
important to remember that the majority of the Cuban economy, the formal economy, and also that formal economy, which is linked into the informal economy, is controlled by gaviota, which is this extension of the military. So the military really is in control of the economy within Cuba. And it doesn't want to be threatened either in terms of politics and power or sovereignty, but they also don't want to be threatened in terms of market opportunities as well. So there's a fine balance for an entrepreneur to be able to hit that sweet spot where they can function effectively as an entrepreneur, but not get so large at which they would threaten the existing economic engines that are there, but maybe get so large as to become an attractive target for inspiring the official means of economic production.
Yes.
I think it's for a very interesting talk. I wanted to have more like, how do you think it's possible, and how do you think that you have developed any strategy by which this, what you are talking about, will not be interpreted as some kind of second wave colonialism of you going there and, you know, harvesting all these wonderful ideas for Cuban people, selling them through regional as strategic and foresight services for others, by which could be interpreted as ripping off of all this creativity from Cuban people. Do you think it is possible to, you know, not down or like transcend that type of...
It's definitely something we considered heavily when we work in any developing country. And I think for that reason we really we try to be facilitators and not interventionists at all. For example,
because you chose that particular word for your title, you know, intervention and designing for Cuba, so it triggers to me all these questions.
Naturally, which I fully understand. But yeah, on the ground we try, for example, the technology that we have invented, or not invented, but the existing technologies are trying to put together and design a solution for an existing problem in Cuba. We really try to be sensitive to behaviors that already exist, what was lacking or what the Cubans were needing, and as well something that would support sort of existing practices of information exchange and entertainment as well. And also in terms of, we do have relationships with businesses there and with individuals there, and it's not in our best interest financially, but we are very interested in enabling kind of Cuban individuals. That's why we aren't supporting like a massive turnover in terms governmentally or politically. We think that would actually, the Cuban individuals get smushed, they get walked all over. They've had 50 years out of experience of having an entrepreneurial spirit or being self-sufficient. So we're very kind of encouraging and inspired by this informal system that's slowly kind of expanding the boundaries of civil society and kind of self-action, so the ability to be self-active. Yeah.
And the majority, I mean, just to clarify, the majority of the insights that we learn, we try to take back and to influence our thinking, to influence our culture and the businesses that we work with.
Because it's, I mean, it's really interesting, and I admire your work very much. But I think the rhetoric of the title is a little bit conceptual.
Yeah, maybe we should be designing with Cuba.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
For information on other online Stanford seminars and courses, please visit study.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.